Good CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative, and welcome back to Black and Well TV. It's Mental Health Awareness Month, and yesterday, Essence Magazine released the results of a survey that found the majority of Black women have reported that this pandemic has negatively affected their finances, access to food, and access to household essentials. However, the data captured one of the more disturbing findings, and that is 63% of women surveyed indicated that their mental health has been negatively impacted. While the survey wasn't scientific, the results align with outcomes that we are personally experiencing and observing among the women in our networks. We're 4 months into this pandemic, and we're already seeing an impact this significant. We're used to seeing statistics that show Black and white women experience about the same rates of depression and anxiety, or maybe even that Black women experience slightly lower rates. And in 2017, Black women died by suicide at less than half the rate of white women. Many psychologists and sociologists say this is because for generations, Black women have had to repress, if not normalize, racism, gender discrimination, and economic oppression. Even if we don't see the impact of this stress in rates of depression and suicide, we do see it in elevated rates of hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and premature mortality. We also know that there's a lack of access to culturally appropriate emotional support and therapy for Black women. I, like many, am concerned that the impact of COVID-19 on Black women's mental and emotional health will be severe and long-lasting. We're beginning to see the seams of once tight-knit families begin to fray. It's vitally important that we speak openly and honestly about how we're feeling and how we're coping during this pandemic to ensure that we get the information and the support that we need. My hope is that after today's broadcast, if you don't remember anything else, you remember that it's okay to not be okay, especially now, and that there are resources available for you. We've got a dynamic panel of experts who not only specialize in providing helpful tools and resources, but who've also been very transparent about their own mental and emotional health journeys. First, we'll talk about the latest trends and data emerging from the impact of COVID-19 on mental and emotional health with Dr. Ayana Abrams. She's a licensed clinical psychologist in Atlanta who specializes in working with women, Black women, with symptoms of anxiety and depression. Then we'll speak with Dr. Shanita Foster. Dr. Foster received the 2019 United Nations Global Award, and today she'll share more about her book, Girl, I'm Not Trippin', I'm Depressed. And then we'll have Dr. Sherry Riley, a life strategist who's worked with people like Usher Raymond and countless others to teach the concept of what she calls exponential living, which she'll explain later today. So let's bring on our first guest, Dr. Ayana Abrams. And I'll remind you, as always, this is designed to be an interactive experience, so we'll be taking your questions throughout. Use the Ask a Question function located at the bottom of the screen or the chat function to the right of the screen to send us any questions you may have. So let's welcome Dr. Abrams. How are you?
I am, you know what I've been telling you? I'm here. I am here. Doesn't mean good or bad, no, but I am here and I am present as I can be.
Okay, well, we're glad you're here.
Thank you.
So I want to start with just sort of a framing or level setting. Since you're a licensed psychotherapist, we use a lot of terms to talk about mental health, emotional health, and sometimes I think we tend to conflate them or use them interchangeably. What's the difference between mental health and mental illness? Can we be sort of emotionally off, but not be mentally ill?
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a great question, and we can be, right? When the ways in which we view mental health and mental illness is on a spectrum, that all of us have mental health. All right, the same ways in which all of us have physical health, but different things that we are a part of, different things that we're engaging in, different things that we have experienced can take us right down the spectrum towards having mental health issues, right? And that would be considered a mental illness in terms of what can be diagnosed. And at any given point at our lives, we might kind of flow at different points of the spectrum just based on what we are going through and how we're recovering from different things that have happened.
Okay. So I could be down, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with me.
Absolutely. All right. So we're looking at ways in which we can normalize really common emotions like sadness, like anxiety, like distress, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have a diagnosable mental illness. You'll have to fit a certain set of criteria and be diagnosed by a clinician in order to be dubbed having a mental illness. But a lot of us move through various emotions based on really common things that happen to us day to day.
Okay. So as you kind of think about your practice and the literature, the research that you're reading, we're 4 months into the pandemic, so it might be a little early for data just yet, but are you seeing any trends and if in sort of changes in Black women's sort of mental illness or reports of mental illness, or based on your experience, are you expecting to see something develop over the next few months?
Yeah, great questions. I think we are beginning to see some trends in what we're noticing, particularly in terms of how Black women are presenting in their families, individually, how they're presenting in their workspaces. These trends are consistent with what we already saw in terms of Black women's functioning, in terms of being very high functioning, finding that they're in a particular role in their families, in their workplaces where they are in more control, they are decision makers, they have a lot on their plates. So we're seeing that now in the midst of the pandemic. And what we're noticing is that, again, the rates of depression, the rates of distress, the rates of anxiety are absolutely up, right? Because even when these things were there that were present before, Black women also had different buffers, right? Different ways in which they can engage in their coping skills, going outside and seeing friends, engaging in exercise, engaging in things that would give them a bit of a break from what they're experiencing in the household or in their workspace. And now with a lot of that being removed, and kind of having this isolation and not having access to the same kinds of support systems or medical care, we are noticing that there are trends of distress that feel a lot more acute.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of distress? What are those symptoms or signs?
Mm-hmm. So the distress that we're seeing is feeling completely overwhelmed, right? Feeling completely discombobulated with these different roles that we're playing that are now colliding, right? We used to have most of us used to have a separation between work and home. So now we are parent and partner and friend and relationship expert and coworker and colleague and sister and daughter and all of that happening in the same space. And when all of those identities feel on top of each other, it's very difficult to differentiate who you are at any given point of day. So we're seeing a lot more scatter, a lot more distress, a lot more decisions to be made in that way, which increases the anxiety and increases our sense of not getting it right. So we're messing up at different things. I can't do this and do this to the fullest capacity. And I'm used to putting my all into these different roles. But how can I, distance teach, my child at the same time? There's, a deliverable due at work and they're due at the same time when oftentimes, again, our systems were separate. So we're seeing that all come to a head. Some other trends that we're noticing that a lot of us on our end and in the community are very worried about is that we're seeing an increase in violence in the home. So intimate partner violence, when we're thinking about child abuse, elder abuse, those rates are going up, right? Because oftentimes the ways in which those things can get alleviated or be called out is when we're outside and we have our support system who can see and engage and connect us around, hey, I noticed that something's going on with you. I'm noticing that this is different about you. But now when we don't have access to those spaces, we're much more isolated in that. So while we're already noticing that, we're also preparing ourselves to see that on the back end of when things return to whatever they will return to.
Right. Yeah, there's no real outlet and there's increased frustration.
Irritability.
A bad combination. Right. So as you kind of think about the therapist's response, I'm thinking, if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I might not know where to turn to. I certainly am not likely to have a therapist since most of us are not under the care of therapists. So how's your practice evolving? I mean, in Georgia, people could come to your office, I presume, since we've sort of opened up. In other states, that's not the case. How are you allowing patients to come in, and what are therapists doing, perhaps maybe even around telemedicine, to help give women an opportunity to have that conversation?
The majority of therapists are doing telehealth right now. So offering on various different platforms, whether it be Zoom, whether it be our particular electronic health record system, that we're offering services by video and by phone. and that's audio, or that's audio and video together, that we're still offering the same services. So that's individual therapy, that's couple therapy, that's family therapy, that's group therapy. Most of us have transitioned to operating face to face, but in this way, it still allows us to have access to our clientele, and still allows clientele to have access to us in terms of support. Okay. There's also been an increase in terms of people accessing online support that's not necessarily with a therapist, but support groups that are online that they can just kind of facilitate and reach in and talk to other women about what's going on. Social media use was already really, really high. So now we're also seeing increased rates of people engaging in that way, just to have some kind of connection and outlet to other people. So that's been a really resource for Black women at this time.
Okay. So like I have quarantine cocktails. We could do the support group maybe without the cocktails.
All of the happy hours, all of the brunches, all those things are happening, but we're cooking every day. So that's
right.
It's different. Right.
So you talked about this feeling of being overwhelmed, but Black women feeling like we're messing up. We often take on a lot of the responsibility, the burden. We feel sometimes that we've got to be perfect. You're familiar with this term, the Superwoman Syndrome, where we have to do everything well, we can't fail. We have to shoulder all the responsibility. I think most therapists would agree that perhaps doesn't serve us well. But would you talk a little bit about what that syndrome is and how women can recognize what the behaviors are, so they can see whether or not they are kind of taking on this responsibility or this syndrome themselves?
I think you mentioned some of the key points, that we realize that there's a lot on our plate, and some things to pay attention to. Again, irritability, fatigue, just low tolerance for things that are happening in your environment. But it comes in taking on the responsibility for all the things that are around you. So I'm taking on responsibility for my employees, for my children, for my partner, for all the roles that are around me, because we have taken on this load, and we have taken on society's call that says that we are the ones who are doing this anyway. Right. I know oftentimes the words that have been used is that, we are the mules. And we're so used to just doing and doing and doing that now society responds to us as though that's the expectation. So even when we do kind of put a boundary up and say, hey, no, I'm tired, I'd like to take a break, a nap, a pause, I need 10 minutes, we get a lot of pushback from other people who say, what? You need what? Where? How am I going to do this if you're not available to me? So we take on a lot of guilt and responsibility when it comes to that.
So how can we combat that? How can we not do that?
Main thing is asking for help, recognizing and allowing ourselves to have space and kind of take breaks and say, I don't have to do this by myself. I don't deserve to do this by myself. I can ask for help just as how everyone asks me for help. I can do the same exact thing that other people do, right? Because that actually allows us to see who can be available to us in the world. When we don't ask for help, that leads us to making more assumptions that nobody can do it for us, right? But we also got to let go of that control that says, I'm the only person who can do this the right way, and allow other people to do things for us, and to do things whichever way they are going to do things. That there doesn't always have to be one way to do these things, but being able to kind of release ties from that can allow other people to actually come in and support us and give us the break that we really, really deserve.
I was just kind of laughing because, you're talking about letting other people, I'm sure you've seen okay, I'm going to ask for help, but now I'm going to tell you how you can help me. Instead of just asking for help, and however the help comes, it comes, not try to direct how that help is.
You have to delegate and let it go and let it happen in that way. And then while it's happening over there, mind our business over here and do something that's actually replenishing and that's nourishing for us, versus still keeping an eye on everything that's happening out there.
Okay. So thank you. We're going to bring on Dr. Shania Foster, and while we're bringing her on, I just want to ask one last question before we bring you back. We hear a lot about sort of contemplation, meditation, and then, that means different things to different people. At this moment in time, can you offer just anything that might help somebody who's not used to meditating, just sort of find that maybe that bit of peace
Yeah. And I think in terms of doing that, being able to offer yourself that this does not have to be this yoga that we see on TV. You can offer yourself 30 seconds in the morning. You can offer yourself 30 seconds while you're in the bathroom. It doesn't have to be where I'm dressed in my yoga clothes and I'm in this Zen moment. I'm in the corner. I've got my lighting and my incense. We do a lot of things to make it have to be a certain way versus it looks like taking 5 deep breaths when you're waking up in the morning. It looks like taking 5 deep breaths in between meetings. Right? It looks like saying, hey, just slow things down. Those are all mindfulness practices. Those are all meditative practices that allows our bodies to really kind of slow down and get into the moment. But it doesn't have to be this kind of grandiose act of giving ourselves this. And once people can understand that more, I think we can give ourselves more opportunity to practice it.
All right. Well, thank you. So we're going to have you come back. We're going to bring Dr. Shanita Foster on. Thank you. To continue this conversation, but I see there's several questions, so we'll have some questions for you when you come back. So thank you. And while we're waiting for Dr. Foster, I'll just remind you all that use the chat function, use the ask a question box. We've got several questions and we're going to try to get to them all. So Dr. Foster, how are you?
I am great. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Congratulations on your award.
Oh, thank you so much.
So we're going to talk a little bit about it in a moment, but I want to talk about the book. The title is unusual, it seems. Girl, I'm not tripping. I'm depressed. So sort of talk about what motivated you to write the book and kind of what does that title mean?
So back in 2014, I suffered a depression and I'm from Detroit. What up, though? And in Detroit, there's this term called tripping. Like, when you're acting outside of yourself or someone wants to call you crazy in a nice way, they'll say you're tripping. So I was going through depression, not knowing it was depression. And my friends and my family members would keep saying over and over again, "Ooh, girl, you're tripping. Why are you tripping so much?" Not knowing that I was going through a full-fledged depression. I had one suicide attempt, thank God, didn't go through with it. But when I came out of my depression, the first thing I wanted to do was write a book that was very transparent, that spoke to the everyday person. I think there's this myth about depression that you have to be broke and broken down and just going through the worst possible thing in your life. And actually in 2014, I was at the highest levels of my life when you look at family and you look at career. And I had done all the things that are staple that they say you're supposed to do: go to school, get good grades, graduate, get married, have some kids, and get a job. So in 2014, those things were in order, and most people couldn't understand why is she upset? Why is she depressed? She lives in a big house. They drive the nice cars. She travels around the world. And it wasn't until I realized my staple saying, when you lose your why, you lose your way. And so I suffered from a depression because I had lost my why in life. It had nothing to do with money or social status. It was that I was no longer able to contribute to my why. And so that took me to the dark place.
So you make a really good point that depression doesn't look any particular way. And we make some assumptions about how we view people's lives and what that means for mental health. So you are a high profile personality, obviously the UN award, but you're an author, you've been on television, you run a business, you're a sought after speaker. So you are very much in demand. And yet you had these feelings. And I think a lot of times we don't always understand them. And in the Black community, there's often a stigma. So we're also less likely to even speak up about it. So, you were very courageous in coming forth about your emotional health, about your depression. Were you concerned about that? And then how did people respond to you?
First of all, I was a little concerned, but if you know my personality, I'm just the one that I'm just going to do what I want to do. But I was very careful because a lot of things that led me to the depression were other people's stories to be told their way. And so oftentimes when people are suffering from depression, depending on what the trigger point is or what it is, they want to hold it back because I've been through a lot of things in my life. When I speak to girls, I say, you know, when I was molested, I didn't want to go and tell my mother because I felt like that was me interrupting her trying to take care of me at a point as a single parent and trying to get through. I didn't want to talk about, you know, being raped, because then that would be me stating that I was being defiant or going against the things that have happened to me. So there was this fear because it was almost like I didn't want to out people or make people feel bad because my kid's father, his transition from football literally to retirement played a big part in my depression because I had to go through a re-identity phase. You know, I tell people all the time, when you get married, that's his wife. When you become a mother, you become their mom. And so you go through this phase where you completely lose your identity. And so, yes, there was fear, and I wanted to be careful not to throw people under the bus and blame people. But at the same time, I knew that my story would change lives and save lives around the world because I realized I wasn't the only person. Once I began to tell a little bit, all of my friends began what I told the Me Too party. Have you ever had a Me Too party? When you say, I did this, and somebody else says, me too. And you say, this happened, and they go, me too. And so I realized, no, this story needs to be told because there's too many people being quiet, being ashamed, and not wanting to share their story.
And in those kinds of, you know, situations, those Me Too parties, it seems like nobody ever says, oh, there's something wrong with you. What happens is people are so happy to know they're not the only one. Was that your experience also?
I think everyone was so excited. I had so many people co-sign on this book. Thank you so much. One of my best friends, the legendary Fred Hammond, came to me and we actually talked about his story, and he wrote the foreword to my book. I spoke with Candy Burrs, Tammy Rahman, Marvin Sapp. There were so many different people that when I began to share what I was going through, how I went through it, how I overcame, it began to turn into that.
Okay.
Not being funny, 2014, taboo and quiet. 2020, everybody is excited to say, I'm depressed. I just want to let you know, I'm depressed. I'm serious.
Yeah,
it's like, it's a sense of freedom now to say I'm going through something, I'm suffering from something. Whereas when I was going through it, I didn't know what to do.
Yeah. So the pandemic may give us sort of that opportunity to find our way and talk about how we really feel.
I think, like the doctor said, not to cut you off, the pandemic has put us in position to now answer to the things that bother us the most. She spoke of domestic violence. It may not have been there to that level, but there was some type of dysfunction that was in that household that was being masked, and it was being covered, and being stuck in the house together has unraveled that. There was probably children that were more so being emotionally abused, and it was just, okay, I'm stressed out and I'm talking to a child this way, that now it's went to the next level because we're all locked inside. So definitely the pandemic has made all of us face a lot of different things, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and financially.
Yeah. So, you know, we often hear the term, check your strong friend. You were certainly the strong friend, I'm sure, in your circle. So based on what you've experienced, what can you recommend for us to do to check on our strong friends? Because sometimes people know something is wrong, but they don't say anything. What would you recommend that we do?
So really, the check on your strong friend, and me being the strong friend, I've recognized that I don't allow people to assume. I've now created accountability partners within my friendship circle, within my personal circle, where I've shared with them some of my thoughts and my feelings. And I've actually shared with them some things now that they thought might be normal, that's not normal. So I let them know if I say I'm feeling tired and I don't want to get out of the bed, they have a 3-day rule. By the third day, if I'm not out the bed, it's time for you to come knock on my front door. It's time for you to come check up on me because they're thinking you're the strong friend. You know, I have friends now, it's really funny with social media. If they see me not post, they're on the phone like, what is wrong? Are you okay? I'm like, I'm fine. Why? They're like, we haven't seen you post. I'm like, no, I'm just busy. but you create this accountability circle, and you let those people know that I love you and I appreciate you and I like being the strong person in your life, but at the same time that I need you to hold me accountable when it looks like I'm going down into that dark rabbit hole, to be there so we could take the necessary precautions to make sure I don't go back into a depression.
Right. That is really a great idea. And that way, you know, somebody's always looking out for you.
Always.
And you're looking out for somebody else.
Yes.
So, well, thank you. We're going to bring you back, obviously, because we got some questions for you. I want to bring Dr. Riley on, and then we'll kind of get back to our questions. So don't go away. We're going to have you come back. So I just want to remind all of you who are listening, watching, to submit your questions. I see there's several of them, so we're going to get to them, as we can. While we're waiting on Dr. Riley, because it was said before, our founder, Billy Avery, once said to me early on, she said, no is a complete sentence. So she told me to use it early and often. So I'm trying to remember to do that. Hey, Dr. Riley, how are you?
I am wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on.
Good. I'm happy to have you. So you also have a book called Exponential Living. Stop spending 100% of your time on 10% of who you are. So yes. COVID-19 is going to be with us for years. Can you talk about, how we can sort of handle that stress now, but what we can sort of plan for the future, to really find out who we are and focus on that?
Yeah, so the core definition of exponential living is pursue peace, choose clarity, and live courageously. Mm-hmm. And when I say pursue peace, is because it is absolutely a daily, and honestly, in unprecedented times like this, it is a moment by moment conscious decision. As Dr. Ayana said, it may be through 5 minutes of just let me slow myself down. There's other practices that we can employ. If you're a person of faith, it may be Bible verses, or it may be mantras. But the most important key to the pursuing peace is that understanding peace is not something that's given to you or taken away from you, because it's never external. Mm-hmm. Peace is an internal commitment and decision that you have to consistently make to yourself, that regardless of what's going on around you, I make the decision on whatever those practices are that I use to stay in my place of peace. Because when we get to that place of peace, there's always clarity. When you get peace, it gives you the clarity. And when you have that clarity, when you bring peace and clarity together, it gives you the courage to make any decisions. If that decision is, I need to take this time and really focus on how do I build, or I take this time and focus on how do I get still, or if you're in that place of survival, where you are absolutely the critical component of taking care of your parents and your children. You're responsible for homework and laundry, and your spouse wants to make love, right? These are all real responsibilities. And you're the anchor to all of that. Well, you have to have the courage to then make the decisions that you don't get lost in the midst of that. So exponential living, especially in these unprecedented times, is about that consistent commitment to pursuing peace, choosing clarity, and living courageously to make those core decisions that are going to not only anchor you, but then benefit everything that you're involved with.
Okay. Thank you. As you were talking, I sort of went to the thought that a lot of us have ideas of things that we want to do, some passions we want to explore, music, painting, whatever it is. And we have those things that kind of, that voice that says, oh, you really want to do this, but we don't, because we have responsibilities, or we think maybe it's not realistic to try to pursue those dreams. Sounds like with exponential living, you're saying give yourself permission to explore those dreams. Don't necessarily think of them as, sort of too pie in the sky. So sort of given where we are now, what would you say to people who are thinking, well, maybe I need to really consider acting on my dreams?
You know, one of the things that my husband and I talked about probably in week 3 of the quarantine was, I mean, we were grieving for the loss of lives, including my cousin, who is one of the closest people to me. When we were really grieving the struggle that a lot of people are in financially. But we also recognize that this opportunity right now was to really leverage what we all said we needed more of, and that is time, right? The commute is now done. We don't have to take our children to all these extracurricular activities. And so the most valuable asset that we were all saying we needed, right, is now time. Now, here's the struggle that we've all met in this place of time. What do we do with it? And where I think we're all trying to find the one answer, right? But the reality is some of us are going to use this time to build. You're going to write that book. You're going to start that business. You know, you're going to use this time to build. But then there's others that they're going to use this time to be still. I mean, they've been going. And the reality is they need to stop, reflect, get organized, take some downtime. And then there's others that are in survival mode. I mean, like I said, you're taking care of parents, you're taking care of children, you're doing homework, you're working remotely, financially, you're struggling, and you're in survival. And the reality is no one person can give you all the answers. So the best thing we can do to really own our peace in this time of quarantine and in this unprecedented time is not be so focused on what other people are saying. The most important voice that we need to listen to is, what are you saying to yourself? What is the conversation you're having in your head? Are you speaking negatively about yourself? Are you waking up and looking at all the struggles and the challenges? Or are you waking up saying, I'm blessed to have this roof over my head. I'm blessed to have these children that I got to go do homework with. You know, what's the conversation in your head? And then when we make that commitment to what is most important to us, then it's like you said, and what I said earlier, then we have to give ourselves permission. We got to give ourselves permission to give ourselves grace. You know what? The laundry is not going to get done today. We got to give ourselves permission to own what's most important for us. And we got to give ourselves permission to create these boundaries. And the most important thing is when you give yourself permission and you take ownership of what's most important to you. Are you building? Do you need to be still? Are you in survival mode? Then you can really tune into the help that you need. That help may be a therapist. That help may be a life strategist like myself. That help may be a webinar or a podcast. But everyone's voice is not the voice that's going to resonate with you. So if you're building, the voice that says be still, that's not who you listen to. If it's time for you to be still, you shouldn't even pay attention to the person that's like, go, 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 go. Because that's not the voice that you need to listen to. But it starts with taking ownership first of what's most important to you.
And it also sounds like trust yourself and listen to that voice. Yeah.
And that's where that confidence comes. When you have peace, clarity, and courage, it is so equal to confidence. And here's the thing that I say, Linda, is that especially as Black women, we are driven. We are some of the most driven human beings in the world, but the area of growth that we need to focus on is our confidence. And drive and confidence are not equal. Drive is what gets you to that level of achievement. Confidence is who you are when you get there. And so as Black women, it's so important for us to be just as committed to our confidence and what it means and how we get there, and understand that drive and confidence are not synonymous.
Yeah, we can get very focused on the struggle and not focus on what that actually means for us. Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you. So stay there. I want to bring on our other panelists, Dr. Foster and Dr. Abrams. I'm going to ask a question while we're bringing them on, because you've in the book. I think it might be easy for a listener to say, well, sure, if you have this kind of a job, if you have this, if you have that, you can live live life exponentially. But what would you say to the woman who still has to go to work? She has, like so many of us, she has to put herself on the front line. She's got to maybe to get on the subway in New York and go to work, be faced with members of the public who are not wearing masks, perhaps, has children at home. She's got to deal with all of that. What would you say to her about just sort of about trying to get that confidence?
You know, when I started the process of transitioning from owning a consulting firm into the space of serving as a life strategist, the principles of this book, Linda, were birthed when I was homeless. My youngest daughter and I lived with my dear friend in her spare bedroom and in hotels. My husband and our oldest daughter lived with my in-laws. I lost my father. My business completely went under in the phase of what it was, transitioning into this next level of service. And so when I birthed these principles, it wasn't from the highest levels of success. It was from the lowest, darkest place in my life. And these principles were birthed out of my own survival. They were birthed out of Sherry. You got to live in your power. You got to pursue peace and a positive mind. You got to have the courage to be faithful, which means healing. And so I say these principles were birthed out of the reality of what a frontline worker is dealing with now, what a person who literally has lost their job or furloughed. Because again, what I learned is these principles apply if you're in your lowest, deepest, darkest pain, or if you're at the highest level of success, like Shanita referenced, and she was in that place of depression and brokenness. The principles apply because they serve us at our deepest rooted place of peace, clarity, and courage in any reality and circumstance. Wow. So I so relate because it was birthed out of my deepest broken pain. And it's what allowed me to endure through to get to that place of really making the decisions on how I protect myself and my family.
Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you. So, Dr. Ayana, I've got a question here. Where can people find counselors in therapy? I mean, and I think we're probably talking specifically Black women, but, and are there some specific resources that you recommend? And another related question, and maybe both of you can even answer this. If you live alone, how can you cope without being able to see members of your family? So, Dr. Ayana, if you take the first one about resources.
Sure. There are lots of online resources to find therapists. So the two that I always recommend is Psychology Today. It's a huge directory of therapists, and you can type in your zip code. You can filter it by insurance. You can filter it by provider. You can filter it by location, all these different ways in which you can get a list that's more curated and tailored for your needs. And I'd also recommend Therapy for Black Girls, who is by local psychologist, Dr. Joy Hart in Bradford. And that's a great resource to find Black clinicians and Black women clinicians who you're looking for. Another resource I'd recommend for people who we love in our lives, any men who we love in our lives, is therapyforblackmen.org. So another reference that is for us and by us that has culturally sensitive therapists there.
Okay. And the question about coping without being able to see or coping with not being able to see your family.
Yeah, I think that isolation and that grieving has been really difficult for us, right? A lot of times we're talking about quarantining with people and how we're navigating that versus when it's me in this space, how do I take the best care of myself? And I always say, stay connected, right? That is the time in which you do your best to reach out and allow people to reach in to you, right? That even though we cannot touch and see people in the way in which we're used to, we can still have a sense of connection to people by seeing familiar faces, by hearing familiar voices. That's also really helpful for us and can be really soothing for us when we're in distress, just having that familiarity.
Yeah. Dr. Sherry?
Yes, and I would just add to that, I totally agree, is also two things. Be very intentional about laughter. Just intentional, whether it's making sure that you find those books that you love that are funny, those movies that you love or that are funny, that friend that you know is always funny, FaceTime them, but also be intentional about periodically switching up your routine, right? So if how can you make adjustments throughout your day and change that routine? Because a lot of times, and I am actually working with clients, companies are asking me to work with their employees that are isolated because they're seeing just how this is having an effect on them. And the most effective thing that we've done is breaking up their routine because they have gotten into this rut of just, this is what I do every day, this is what I do. So breaking up that routine and making sure you're intentional about what laughter is for you. And then lastly, being able to just find, one of my clients literally made a journey out of going to the mailbox. You know, I so encourage those individuals that are isolated, use that creativity to create outside of your routine ways that activate that child in you, that activate that joy in you when you were just young and silly and funny, because the anxiety and pressure of what we're living in is heavy enough. So be intentional about what's that funny, crazy, silly, stupid thing that you as a 45-year-old Black woman can still do, and just have a good laugh at yourself and with someone else that you FaceTime with and share it with them.
Well, I can attest to laughter. I have an 11-month-old grandson, and so his parents, he's in New Jersey, his parents send videos, and it doesn't really matter what he's doing. If I need a break, if I need to laugh, that's the purpose. Is I look at his videos, I look at his pictures, and then I'm good for the next few hours until the next time I need to look at him. So, Dr. Sherry, one more question.
And you go back to that movie. I was going to say, go back to that movie that you watched as a youth that you can find on Netflix or somewhere. That was when you were 15 years old, that just made you crack up.
How do you communicate your need for help to family and friends? I mean, we talk about how important it is to ask for help, but it's not always easy to ask for help.
Yeah. And it goes back to giving yourself permission. And it goes back to that drive versus confidence. Drive will make you believe I'm invincible, I'm Superwoman, right? I can do this. But confidence allows you to walk in the truth of who you are, and makes you understand asking for help doesn't minimize who you are. It doesn't minimize the impact that you bring into the world. And it definitely doesn't make people look negatively at you. And so when you give yourself permission, and here's the key word, to be vulnerable. When you give yourself permission to be vulnerable, as Black women, we look at that word as such a negative reality. But the truth is, our strength is in our vulnerability. I'll share this quickly. A friend of mine who actually had COVID, she was in the hospital for 4 years. She sent me a text last night that said her weakest moment was when she admitted that she was ready to give up because the pain was so bad. But she woke up the next day and her body started to heal. And I'm a woman of faith. I don't put my faith on anyone. But the text I sent her back was, that wasn't a moment of vulnerability. That was when you a moment of weakness. That was when you gave yourself permission to be vulnerable. And that's when the grace of God was able to meet you at your request. And that's exactly what happens when we ask our friends and families for help, is that area of vulnerability allows people to go, oh, that's where I can help her. Because a lot of times people want to help us, but we're so strong, they don't know how.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking about, to the earlier point, women who've lost their jobs, women who still have to go to work, and to potentially put themselves in harm's way. I mean, how they are certainly feeling vulnerable, I would think. But what would you say to them to help them through, sort of make sense of all of this?
Is that for Dr. Ayana?
For both of you, yes.
Oh, what would help them? And that's honestly the biggest struggle I have with everything right now, is that people have to choose between a living and living, right? People are having to choose between a living and living. And the reality is there are single parents, there are individuals that they have to go back to work. And they are putting themselves at risk, but it's a reality that they have to face. So the natural things that we know, follow the social distancing and the mask. I mean, those things we know. I want to speak more to the psychological. And that is, don't beat yourself up. Don't beat yourself up. And really speak words of encouragement. In these places where it is an absolute necessity, our attitude is critical. Because if you face every day with the attitude of defeat and beat yourself up because of where you are, you're going to continue to add to the weight of the reality. So the reality is you have to go to work. The reality is that you are in this position. The truth is you still have the power to protect yourself. You still have the power to love yourself in this truth. You still have the power to make sure that you are the best you in this reality. And so that's why I would encourage people is be able to separate the reality of what you have to do with the truth of who you are, and not allow your own internal voice to beat you down and defeat you, so that you have the power to go out and be your best self in these absolutely trying times.
Yeah. Dr. Ayana.
To add to that, that's where, a lot of self-compassion, right, is really, really important for us during this time. And being able to allow yourself to acknowledge that this is hard. This is scary, that I don't have to do this with this brave face and just, push through when nobody knows what's going on. So kind of tapping back into that vulnerability that says allowing yourself to feel scared, right? Allowing yourself to feel angry that I even have to make this decision, right? To put myself at risk in these ways, allowing yourself to really acknowledge that these are normal and common feelings. And I also get to feel these things, that these feelings aren't just for other people, right? So Black women being able to kind of incorporate that and say, I get to have these feelings all day, every day, because this is what comes with this particular territory, and allowing our bodies kind of just room to feel that and to honor that we get to do that, right? And then also to allow ourselves to have some grieving around that, right? That I'm grieving that I don't get to make a different decision for myself, right? I feel envy in these spaces, right? When we're able to be more honest with ourselves, that's how we can really attach to a support system that allows us to be in that space. But not telling ourselves that I don't get to feel this way because it's not going to help me, versus allowing your body to have these very, very normal reactions to crisis, that this is a crisis that we're in.
And it sounds like if ever there's a time to practice self-care, and even if that self-care is to just give yourself that grace, just to say, it's okay, I have these feelings, they're mine, but it's okay to have them. This is the time.
This is the time. This is the time.
Yeah. Well, ladies, thank you very much. I want to thank you, Dr. Ayanna Abrams, Dr. Sherry Riley, Dr. Shanita Foster. Thank you for spending a few minutes of your day with all of us to talk about emotional health, to talk about mental illness, to talk about giving ourselves grace and being who we really are. We really appreciate it. Please be safe. Please be well. And we look forward to the next conversation. And I want to thank you all for joining us. Please join us next Friday where we'll discuss the importance of participation in clinical trials. It's particularly relevant now as we hear all the stories of vaccines and therapeutics that are being developed and evidence-based medicine. And what we know is that whole segments of the population are being left out of the creation of that evidence. So we'll be talking about how to change that and what we can do. If you haven't already, take a moment to visit our website, coronavirus.bwhi.org, where we've developed to provide information and provide other resources to you in addition to those that you've heard today. And I'll just end with this note. We've heard a lot about just being kind to ourselves, being who we are, honoring what that means. And it takes me back to a survey that the Black Women's Health Imperative did some 3 or 4 years ago, where we asked Black women to define health. And we just said, give us words and phrases, whatever health means to you. And about 85% of the words and phrases Black women used were psychosocial words like, I'm calm, I'm at peace, I'm in control. About 10 or so % of the words they used to define health were financial. I can take care of my children, I can keep a roof over my heads. Only about 5% of the words or phrases that Black women used to define health had anything to do with disease state or physical health. So what that said to us is Black women were saying, well, if I can get my mind right and my spirit right and my money right, I can take care of everything else. So we respond to stress. This is a very stressful time. And what health means to us really has to do with how we respond to stress. Black women, on average, have about 15% more of a stress hormone called cortisol in their bloodstream, which actually can accelerate our aging process. There's something called weathering, where we literally age faster than white women. But this cortisol, this weathering process, also triggers our inflammatory response and our metabolic response, which actually leads to gaining weight. It is not simply a matter of overeating. It also raises our risk for chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. And that in turn raises our risk for COVID-19. So we've heard a lot in the news about these underlying conditions. Well, these underlying conditions can be traced back to the external stressors that we face, like low wage employment, neighborhood segregation, disinvestment in our schools and communities, these stressors impact our physical health as well as our mental health. And the thing that we need to know especially is that these high rates of COVID-19 are not our fault. So even as we physically separate, we have to maintain social connections, as you heard. As I said earlier, it's okay to not be okay, but I encourage you to seek counseling or other professional help to sort through the challenges that you're having. Talk with a friend, a trusted friend, open up to your sister circles, and never be ashamed about your mental health needs. You are not alone. Long before the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Women's Health Imperative made mental and emotional health a high priority. These are uncertain times, and no one knows when things will be anywhere close to normal or, frankly, what the new normal will be. However, as we navigate these murky waters, let's make sure that we have the tools and the resources that we need to stay afloat. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.